Welcome to the Art of Growth and a new year. This is Jim Zartman, and today Joel Hubbard and I are starting a new season, a new year, a new direction. As you know, we spend a lot of time talking about self-awareness and the Enneagram and personal growth, but there's another component to this, which is the social awareness. And so we want to spend some time talking about that. Before we jump into today's episode, if you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter at theartofgrowth.org. And if you have any questions about coaching or training for your organization, you can reach out to us there as well. Now, in this episode, we refer to a Harvard happiness study. And if you look in the show notes of this episode, I have left a link to that article. So I would encourage you to check that out. But for now, let's jump into this first episode around connection. So this whole series that we are going to be embarking on came out of a conversation where we were talking about how we have spent so much time over the last few years talking about the inner world, the inner growth. But then one of the things you said something along the lines of like, but you do not actually have a full concept of your identity outside of community. Mm-hmm. So it's really in the exchange, the relationships of the people around us that we see this. But then when I was thinking about all the conversations we had and all the podcasts we're going to hit, this one phrase that you said stuck out to me a lot that I think is going to be something we return to throughout this whole series, where you said the ego isn't designed for connection, but protection.
Yeah.
So we're gonna go through all this. Our starting point today is we're gonna start to name the problem. Like, what do you see out there? What are you perceiving is happening right now with people in connection and isolation? Like, what are some of the things that prompted you to want to also dive into this?
Probably years of talking to folks who are usually talking about some kind of relationship. You know, when they're talking to us about, getting some coaching, there's certainly their own inner challenges, issues that they're dealing with, such as like their image of themselves, the sort of career and how that's going. But inevitably it goes to relationships as well. Yeah. And what I would find was that, and it was reflective of my own life. Every time I coach somebody, I think of the same thing about myself. Am I doing the same things? Which I was finding a lot of this difficulty people had with real connection. So I could see the ego kicking in and trying to get its needs met its way, not trying to get its needs met by a sort of mutuality or an ability to receive. I have phrased this in so many different ways where it's some who can give but can't receive, and others who seem to be receiving. I don't think it's true receiving, but it's sort of a taking, but have a difficult time giving.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we can do both unless there's an ability to do it in the context of true connection with another person. And true connection can't happen unless we are walking down the path of vulnerability, openness to another person, truthfulness, the ability to actually receive from a person, like genuinely receive, not just consume, take what we want, but receive what is being given to us. And that's different than just selectively picking and choosing what it is we think we need.
Yeah, you've said this when it comes to couples, you've said this about parents, but sometimes we tune so much into the way we want to be loved that we miss the way that this person is already trying to love us in their way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's actually so good for us. We think it's not what I need, it's not what I want right now. But if we are a social species, we are made to actually thrive by being together and by this exchange that happens between us. Yeah. And again, I think it's just the ego gets in the way.
Yeah. One of the things that prompted us to even want to go down this is we both listened and read the same, I think it was a NPR story around the Harvard happiness study of seeing who are the most happy. And it was consistent throughout this 85 years that they see that the quality of people's relationships really determine their level of life satisfaction. And then we also both got into watching that Blue Zones series on Netflix, and there it's actually even health, like physical health and emotional health, has to do with the quality of our relationships as well. I just heard a psychologist talking about how people who are the most isolated, their bodies stay in a low-level fight or flight response. So your stress hormones, cortisol, that is higher. All of that has a deleterious effect on your immune system and on your body. So one of the things prompted us is we wanted to talk about this sort of epidemic of loneliness. What's prompting it? Why is it happening? What can we do about it? How do we address it? But we do hear about this all the time. People talking about feeling, a lack of community. And some of it is like in humorous form. I've seen, memes. There's a video I saw the other day pop up on a reel or something like that, where this guy was saying, I don't really have enough relationships and friendships in my life. And the person replied, do you think to have relationships, you probably need to leave your house and spend time where people are? And the guy going, not worth it. And then going back. And it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of like, I think there's a lot of that happening.
Yeah.
Remote work, there's so much of this happening.
Yeah. And then we begin to treat, you talk about work, you start to treat people and in transactional ways. It's like, I need this from you. This has to be done by so our communication becomes stiff. It becomes punctuated. It becomes very, very short. So there's no affect in there because we're so stressed and we have to get stuff done.
Yeah.
That's not universal. It doesn't happen everywhere all the time, but it does happen in high stress environments. And so you have less of that. Well, and then you imagine then you go to the store and let's say you go through the checkout and there it's also extremely transactional. Very little like, hey, how are you? Very little of that happens. So you can imagine you're constantly around people who you should have connection with.
Yeah.
But you're constantly being disappointed by that. And most of the time we're not tuning into that, but I would suggest it's micro disappointments. It's like so small you don't really perceive it, except that you become more cynical about human nature and about humanity in general. You just become more cynical, more skeptical. You just don't expect anything from people. And then if you go home, and let's say your home environment is one in which you are so busy because you have kids, you've got a partner, you've got so much there to do that also can become like, okay, time to brush your teeth. Okay. Did you do your homework? Okay, this. And then, even with partners, it can become that way too. Like, did you pick up the eggs at the store? Did you do this? Did you close the door? Did you lock? It's all of that. And I wonder if the setting of our lives is also very unhelpful. The context, our setting is very designed in a way. And we can blame the settings, and I think that's in part true, but it's also in part that we've created some of the setting. It's maybe reimagining how can we change that so we can deliberately help ourselves through the setting to have a better context for connection.
That's an interesting thing you talk about setting. I did just see a video. I can't remember what country in Europe they were, but they were talking about how in certain parts of Europe, they really value this thing called the third space. So you have like your first space, which is your home. Second place is work. And they're saying that America doesn't have a lot of like the third space. So a third space, they were demonstrating like these courtyards where people would hang out.
Yeah.
The adults would be out around the edges, like having conversations or even doing work. And the kids are like in the middle playing.
Yeah.
So like there were certain kinds of playgrounds. I think the original business model of Starbucks was to create a third place.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so that was kind of their idea. It was like, yes, communal and work and all of these things could be happening. People going on dates there or having interviews there, and all of that was happening. But how like our culture in general doesn't have a lot of this, what we call third space. And there's not the expectation that you're going to meet or connect with someone in some of these public spaces, right? So we were invited recently to a couple like networking events, and it was so fun because the whole point is you're supposed to talk to strangers.
Yeah.
You're supposed to randomly walk up to a group of people and just butt into the conversation and then get to know people. And it was awesome.
Yeah, it was.
We were both like buzzing after those things.
There's a lot of energy. Yeah.
Because it was like, it's connected to what we care about in our work, and we're meeting these people, and like we're following up and having conversations and all of that. It feels like, oh, I'm a part of what's happening in my city and the network, and all of that like does create a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Even like the Art of Growth's belonging in our city, in our state, like even to that level, which was interesting. But there was an aspect that you brought up when we were naming the problem that it would sound woo-woo to me if I didn't know it to be deeply true, which is this thing about when it comes to loneliness and isolation, this idea of exile. Could you just give a snapshot of your thinking around that?
Yeah. I've thought a lot. As you know, I've talked to you a lot about this idea of exile. To me, I think that there are different origin stories, certainly, different cultures. There's a couple that I really enjoy. One is from the Kabbalah, and the other one is from the Hebrew scriptures in Genesis. But it's this idea that, according to the Kabbalah, that at one point, the divine figure, the eternal one, I think is the way it's called, is fills everything up with itself. It completely fills the entire universe, let's say. And then there's a point at which the divine figure pulls itself back in order to create space for others, or to create space for creation to take place. And different renditions of it have it in different ways, but at some point, the light of the divine light is put into these vessels, these 10 vessels. But they can't contain it, and so they shatter, and the fragments go everywhere. And then there's a point at which there's a return of that we're supposed to be ones who find the light and bring it back to its whole. So we're looking for light wherever it is, and we're bringing it back, and there's a return. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Some of my favorite origin stories. And in the book of Genesis, you have this idea of being exiled from the garden, and then there's a constant moving outward. There's like an exile away from home. And I think it's psychologically true. I think that's why it sticks. It's because we know the feeling of being pushed out and exiled. And there's always this hope for return. But we know it even from birth, because at one point, we're in our mother's womb, and there is no distinction between the self and the mother, the source, right?
Yeah,
exactly, the source.
Exactly,
The source, right? Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, the reason why it's so beautiful to make that comparison between that and the divine, because it's like at some point, all things are one, complete unity, and then there's this, big bang, this explosion. In the mother's womb, there's this exile, and we're forced out. And when we're forced out, it's a violent forcing, and it's a violent exile out, and then we are faced with a very cold world in which we are now alone, separated from, and of course the baby's brought back to the mother, and hopefully there's a bond that takes place there. But it's still, you have been exiled. So you know that. You know that from very early on, and I think that that's the sense that we carry within ourselves, and because of that, we have to protect ourselves from the pain of disconnection. This is what I think the ego does, more than it's there to meet any need. I think it's there to protect us from the pain in any way, which is why we continue to protect ourselves from pain, which is the protective brain. It's the protective mind as opposed to sort of the thriving mind. And I think that that's the biggest challenge we have for that return from exile to connection, to source, is that it requires us to move from that protective brain to one that's more open and can relax into connection. But I know that from a real internal visceral feeling, even prior to connection. When I'm relaxed, connection happens.
Yes.
Right? And when connection happens, I'm also relaxed. I also find myself relaxing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of both things are happening. And I find I'm not as angsty. I'm not as anxious or hurried or needy.
Yeah. It's interesting because I can almost spot sometimes the internal energy to where I'm going protection,
Oh, yeah.
connection,
Yeah.
protection.
Yeah.
And I think this happens all the time because I see people, whether they're, dating again after having been in a relationship for years. And it's like, there's this hope of connection and then this pull back to protection, or I've been really busy and now like I actually need to like make new relationships. I need to like go on interviews and be able to interact with people. I need to do whatever. And it's this, I need to put myself out there and have hope of something I desire or need to happen. And then the pull back. And I see this happening in myself all the time. And I wonder how many people would relate to this feeling of like this desire for connection. And so there's a lean in. And then there's either a fear of disconnection or a pain or this confirmation. And then there's a pull back. And we all do it for different reasons. Several different aides have said, and then one of them phrased it the other day so perfectly, which is this belief that I need to be prepared to be abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
And so each type would have a different explanation on that or a different phrase for that. But the core thing that I think is universal is this moving back and forth between those energies and self-preservation and needing to protect myself and the connective one, because we need that too.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly being pushed and pulled, I think, back and forth in those energies.
I think that's well said. And because I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think it's like you're always in the ego brain just protecting itself or always looking for connection. I think it is very much we're torn with both. We have a need for both.
Yeah.
And in any given moment, one gets, you might get triggered. You're in a relationship and things are going well and you're connecting well, and then something happens. You and the message you receive from that event is what your bias is looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So it confirms, just like you said, the aide who says, I'm prepared. I have to be prepared to be abandoned, to be let down. Well, if that's your bias, you're looking for it, right? And if you're looking for it, you're going to find it. And so that molehill turns into a mountain, and then there's this like real strong reaction to it. And I think for all of us, that's what we're facing in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like we're setting the reality here of like this is what we all deal with, which is why connection is really difficult.
Yes. Because even what we are often seeking in connection, and there's a whole lot of psychologists talking about this right now, is we're actually seeking confirmation of what we believe about the world and what we think people are going to treat us like in our interaction, like more than we're actually seeking healthy connection.
Mm-hmm.
So we seek protection more than we seek connection. But in order to have that protection, we're seeking confirmation of the story that we have. So there's lots of examples where if you had a chaotic family life as a child, what people tend to seek in a relationship is they tend to recreate what that is familiar.
Yeah.
Right? The devil that you know. So I'm looking for confirmation that this is what love looks like, that it looks chaotic. I had a family member who stayed with us for a few weeks. And after 2 weeks, she kind of confusingly looked at Abby and I and said, what's weird? I've been here for 2 weeks and I haven't heard anyone yell. Because the perception is that if a family is together, that there's a lot of like yelling involved, that there's a lot of like harsh words exchanged. And to be in our home for a while and see none of that was almost like a jarring thing. So, because even when she shared that, it was from a very skeptical kind of statement, kind of like, what are you hiding? Was the belief.
It's not real. It can't be real.
It can't be real. Yeah. Right. And I've had that people say that about watching Abby and I. I've literally had single friends say, I don't really understand how relationship works. I look at the two, I'm just kind of confused. Like, what's really going on there? Like, how does this, how?
Yeah.
I had one that just did that. They just pointed back and forth, like, how? Even with like friendships, with relationships, with community, with the people you find yourself with, you have to have a level of awareness to understand when you're seeking connection, when you're seeking protection and being aware of the mechanisms that are looking for confirmation.
Yes. Yeah. The awareness is massive, because if you don't, you're just wondering, why did that relationship fall apart?
Yes.
And the phrase that drives me crazy is, I don't know what happened. We just ended up parting. We just ended up going two different directions. It's like, I don't know what happened, to me is it's indicative of like lack of awareness. You weren't paying attention to what was going on internally. But it's not, it's not I can't make this into an accusation. I think it's just an awareness of, I am aware to a degree, and I also lack awareness to another degree. And so when something happens, this is what I've said before, like triggers are teachers, man. They can really start to open your eyes to yourself.
Yeah.
If you pay attention to them.
Yeah. One of the things we wanted to talk about this in this sort of connection crisis part of what's happening in the world around us was we wanted to talk about the substitutes for connection.
Yeah.
Because we're going to get into like real connection, how to establish that. But I think to develop this awareness, we need to know what we seek, what kind of confirmations we seek, and some of the areas in which there's what I like to call proxy fulfillment. So it's almost like it's being fulfilled, but it's not really being filled. Like, I want a loving partner, but that's really hard. So the person at the corner bar or on the dating app who's going to kind of make me feel better for a day or a week, then that'll work for now. I'm like, proxy fulfillment, because to have real fulfillment, it takes time, it takes patience, it takes energy. You have to check in, you have to involve the community around you, and all of these things can be difficult. And so because genuine connection is so difficult, we were talking about some of these substitutes. And one of them plays into the podcast from last week where you talked about the archetypes. So one of the things that can create connection is this shared shared enemy, the shared villain. Yeah, what we oppose together.
Yeah. On one hand, having a shared villain. So we all seem to need a villain, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, what is the threat? Where's the danger at? I know there is. I just need to know what it is. That could become its own, creating, or it becomes the thing that creates groups around that whole thing. Like, okay, so Democrats are the enemy, or
Republicans
are the enemy. Yeah. For the church world, it can be, culture, secular society.
Some other country is the enemy.
Some other country, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen so much of that in my lifetime where it's the country is either divided and they need an enemy internally. Yeah. So you have, it's like the right versus the left kind of a thing. The only time I see them really come together is then we have an externalized enemy.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right.
And some other country that's some other country, then we can come together.
Yeah.
Because as long as we have an enemy.
Yep. And that can be a source of, on one hand, validation. Certainly some people, you feel like maybe you've been mistreated by the boss. And so you go and look for to have conversations with others, and they feel the same way. Well, there is a cathartic experience of like, maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe I'm not alone in this. And maybe there is something here.
Yeah.
And then there's all of a sudden a person I've maybe said two words to becomes a friend. We start hanging out now. We start talking a lot.
But what you bonded over. So this is like a huge thing for me that really, really bothers me is this idea of venting. And I hear people talking about it, and I am so anti-venting because like there's even more data coming out on this. I just saw a couple pieces that was so good for my soul because I felt like this is something I've been championing for years, is that when we vent, we don't actually dissipate the energy within us. We enhance it. It is enhanced and increased by the exchange of that negative energy with another person. So it can feel cathartic in the most negative version of catharsis. So there's an aspect where I see this with couples a lot. If they talk crap about their partner behind their partner's back, it will enhance the energy within them that is opposed to their partner. Whereas opposed to this, if they keep that to themselves and they just work on it with their partner, they don't have the same kind of like negative implications.
Okay, but I'm going to counter that with there are some times where it is, as someone's emerging from, say, that womb-like experience, where the womb-like experience sounds very positive. Like we were talking about when you're in your mother's womb, you're fully connected. But there is something that's not quite complete there because you don't have an identity yet. You haven't formed that.
Right.
And so it's not really the sort of unity where you both retain your identity, but you're not disconnected from that other person. There's a sense at which unity has found a place, a harmonization, right? A harmony means that there is a distinct voice and there's another distinct voice and they're coming together. The womb-like experience will always necessitate an exile. And that exile, when you first come out of that, you are starting to form an identity. And so let's say you're in a relationship where that is where it's an unhealthy relationship, we'll just call it that. And a person's emerging from that and they're starting to strengthen muscles they've never had before.
Yeah.
And there's like, so now they're naming some problems with the previous environment and they're needing to in order to get a sense of who am I distinct from that? Right.
Yes.
It's sort of like and that is the path that we take from that unity to identity. Who am I? Back to unity. So at that point, I think when we're doing a sort of pushing against, if we do it, it's not, you're not going to do it perfectly, but if you can continue down that path to moving back towards, okay, the villain needed to be externalized for a little bit. I did. I needed to separate from my previous environment by calling it bad or whatever else.
Yeah.
Now I'm coming back to like, okay, now I can nuance that a little bit. I can see where some of that was definitely me, So I do see some positive in that, but it has to continue down that growth path to then come back to the place of unity and connection. To the point you're making is, if the only thing we're doing is having a common enemy, and that's the bond we've created. Yeah. That's a substitute. So that's
and
proxy
our
fulfillment.
common enemy is your spouse or your partner.
Yeah.
Like and we've been having the same conversation month after month, year after year.
Right, exactly.
That's the stuff that that's so toxic.
That's right. And that's the stuff so that's a substitute. That's a proxy fulfillment for connection. And there are a lot of places where that shows up. As you know, I'm at the gym obscenely 6 or 7 days a week, usually 6 days. Well, I don't do 7 days. But the stories and the conversations, they're always about like, who's the enemy, So there's like teasing around that. They generally get along quite well. But there's that like, he's the liberal. Oh, yeah. So, and that's the way they kind of speak about things to each other.
Right.
And so there's this need, again, to like, we are bonded, and we were bonded around a sort of like, we see the common enemy. There's also a bonding around play. So I think that there are a lot of different settings where we can start to see, hey, these settings could lead you to good connection, but they can also become substitutes to the deeper connection.
That's interesting because what you just gave the example of there in the gym, it is this overlap between, you're saying there's a lot of like what we're against is a bonding thing, but you're also bonding over play.
You're bonding over play,
which
absolutely.
is a really positive way to bond.
Yeah. And there is, and I can see that that's protected. Like there's an insistence on, hey, we're here to have fun, we're here to play, we're here to laugh. And if someone becomes overly angry about something and they're yelling at others, that person they seem to get marginalized because the others are like, we're not here for that. We're here to kind of play and have fun and be stupid with each other, and that should be okay if we can do that.
Yeah.
And so that does create a kind of connection that I think is pretty healthy. But again, this is just levels of connection, right? You can.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that connection isn't a one and done thing where you have it or you don't have it. I am convinced it is something that's a practice that's ever calling to deepening, and also a kind of separating, a sense of where, okay, I'm moving away because I'm discovering some things about myself.
Yeah.
And then coming back so that I can have a deeper sense of unity. And I think that is necessary. You have to also know who you are and continue to understand yourself. And then you come back into a relationship at a deeper connection. That's definitely been my experience with Patty. It's definitely, for me, I see it over and over again where I come away and I think, No, I haven't said my truth about this, and I need to speak that, and I know that's going to cause a separation, and I do it. But if we continue to do it with that, remember, we're in this together. We're in this for connection with each other. We're committed to that. Let's keep moving in that direction. It does actually produce better connection.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think the healthiest connection gives a lot of space for individuation.
Yes. That's very, very good. Yeah. Very well said.
I think that is so important because otherwise you have these terms like codependent enmeshment. That is where there's so much connection, but there's no individuation.
Yes.
So if there's not enough individuation in the connection, it's not actually a healthy connection.
Yeah.
Because connection should be I move toward and I also regain and understand a depth of my own identity as I pull and then move. It should be like the moving in and out of that tide. It should flow that way.
Yeah.
Where there is no individuation, you don't have connection. You have reliance and you have codependence and you have enmeshment, and it's not a healthy picture.
Well, and we see that in tribalistic kind of mindset. So if you're in a group, whether it's a social group or a church, and it becomes this thing of like, I can't disagree. I can't actually say something here. Because if I do, then I get exiled out of the system, or I get sort of marginalized, or So in that environment, it's not a deeper level of connection. There is a kind of connection, but it's not a deeper kind, and it is around that sort of. See, it's not unity; it's more of an undifferentiated environment. So we kind of have these foul lines.
Yeah,
we mostly agree. We can't disagree on certain key things. We all have these agreements around them. And that becomes another one of those, I think, proxy fulfillments where it's about agreement.
Yeah, conditional connection.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who have gone through some kind of a deconstruction or a faith process where they'd been in some kind of a spiritual tradition where they experienced conditional connection. You belong, you're family. As long as you don't ask that or think that or believe that or go down this foul line, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what else to call it other than conditional connection. It's like we are like family as long as you don't disagree with us about any of this stuff.
Yeah. Speaking of families, I mean, that's another place where you're going to see, we were talking to, I'll keep this very anonymous, but so the culture that this individual grew up in was one in which nobody can disagree with mom. And so there's like, and this individual is a type 8 and said, I didn't have a need that I didn't feel like I needed to have my needs met by everybody, or I wasn't dependent enough. And so because of my independence or my, I can meet a lot of my own needs, it was like I'm sort of on the outside now of this toxic kind of environment. But it was enmeshment. It was a very codependent kind of, for the family anyways. And so if you're the one who starts to go, well, I don't really have many needs that need to be met, and the system is one in which mom is in charge and meets the needs of the family, and you're all kind of expected to be needy of that, or dad's always the one telling you what to do and how to do what to do, but you don't need that anymore, and it disrupts the whole family. Meanwhile, the other kids are fine because they're compliant types, right? So an attachment styles are compliant, stances rather, they're compliant. They're just going along.
Yeah.
Well, then what happens when the one says, I disagree or I don't need that?
Right.
Well, then that connection gets severed.
Yeah.
And in a lot of family systems, it really does get severed. It's like you're not part of this undifferentiated, enmeshed kind of system, so you don't belong, or you don't feel you don't have access to that connection any longer.
And the number of people we talk to who refer to their families in some way and don't feel like they belong in their own families in some way, and they want to, and they're trying to connect, and then something happens. I mean, that comes up all the time, because when we talk about this connection, and this comes up in our coaching, for some people it's like a parent-child relationship. For some it's partners. For others it's like my siblings and their families, extended family stuff. And some it's like, where do I fit into this community that I'm a part of, that I feel kind of on the outside of, but I really care about, and they feel they've helped make me. Because I do believe, that we deeply know that community are identity co-creators.
Yeah.
You don't have an isolated identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
If so, that's, I don't know if narcissistic is the right term for it, but it's very myopic I only see the world as how I see myself, when the reality of who you really are is always this hybrid of how others experience you to be and how you see yourself.
How you see yourself, yeah.
And you don't ever see yourself that clearly.
No.
None of us do. As much self-awareness as we work, we need those mirrors. There's a reason our brain has all these mirror neurons, because we need mirrors in our lives to actually even be able to see ourselves with any level of reality.
Oh my gosh. So very true. How many times I thought I was so self-aware, and then had conversations with, Patty, and she would point out, like, this is the way we experience you. It's like,
right.
Dang, it's absolutely right. We have to be confronted with that to see it.
I just heard a stat. I don't know what it was. It just flashed in my mind, and I don't know the basis of it. I just thought it was interesting where they were talking about 75% of people perceive themselves as being self-aware, and only 15% are. In my experience, that has played out with all the people that I've seen.
How many people have said, like, they tell me how they think they're being experienced, or how they think they're coming across.
Every company we work with.
Like, you're not coming across that. Wow.
Yes.
You really think that.
But every company we've worked with, we've been working with someone, we've been assigned to work with someone who this person thinks they're really self-aware. And the reason we want you to coach them is everyone around them is like, this person is not at all self-aware. So there's this huge gap.
Yeah.
And your perception of yourself, it's not steeped in reality.
Yeah.
Because everyone around you is experiencing you as the opposite of the thing you think you are. And it can't all be them.
No, that's true.
Yeah. I had someone say to me it was a very hard moment to hear it, but it was after I'd gone through a pretty traumatic thing. And they said something along the lines of, any explanation of a situation that doesn't include your responsibility is not a realistic perception of it.
That's right.
And I was so challenged and offended and knew it was right. I don't think I would have been so offended if I didn't know it was right.
Yeah, right.
But it was
exactly
so deeply true to me, going, okay, I'm actually not paying attention to something that I contributed to this.
Yeah.
Which I can look back at that situation now and clearly see a lot of ways that I contributed to it.
Me too.
But at the time, but it was still that community that helped me understand that thing about myself and see it in a more reality.
Well, and I believe that if communities could function this way, they would continue to grow. And I think any community that doesn't grow, because it's this sort of like, again, we have this system where we expect you to be dependent, or we expect you to be compliant and not to disagree with anything. We expect that we all agree. We expect that we have a common villain. Any system that is not growing like that, I think that to me is the problem. Connection happens through growth. It happens through this back and forth, as we were saying, where I don't think this way, or there's something I'm aware of in myself, and the group will change along with you. You will change as well. So I think any group has to have this conversation, this dialogue between each other, how we're experiencing one another, how we're growing, what's the reality of our impact on other people.
Yeah.
And how are we going about trying to make connection? I just did a coaching session with a couple that was part of the challenge, was one person's trying to get connection one way.
Yep.
And the other one's trying to get connection a different way. And both are pathologizing and moralizing the other. It's like...
Which is what we tend to do.
Well, yeah. You're doing it wrong, and I don't do it that way. And it's like, well, as long as you're doing it that way, you're not going to get to that place of connection. So you're going to have the awareness around, that's what I'm trying to do. That's the way I'm trying to get connection. And it is my need. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong. Set that up. Like, there's nothing wrong. It's actually really good to state what your need is clearly, but without the demand that the world meets it exactly how you think it should be met.
Right. Because that's the other side, is other types, they then fault themselves or shame themselves for their needs.
That's right.
And to them, we've had to have
Yeah.
these conversations around, no, your need is neutral.
Yeah.
Sometimes the way we go about fulfilling that need is this proxy fulfillment thing. It is this confirmation thing we're talking about. And so we want to zoom out a bit more and get a bit of a wider perspective. But even in that context, it's a great step of awareness, which is what we want people to have, to go, oh, this is the way in which I'm asking for connection.
Yeah.
And it's not lining up or it's not matching. Well, at least you can name it. This is a great starting point.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge step. And that's what as we kick this series off, this is what I want people to see, is just to start to tune into the awareness of, like, in those little bids for connection.
Yeah.
And this is going to come up again, this concept of the bids for connection. Where are you seeing connection and where are you looking for protection?
Yeah.
And if you're going to go really deep into it, is where are you trying to confirm a belief about how relationships or the world works?
Mm-hmm.
And get excited when you're looking for confirmation and the confirmation fails, because that means you're actually going to have a wider worldview.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to see that relationships don't always work that way. They are bigger, they are wider, they can be more wonderful, more interesting than you ever imagined. That what you've experienced is not normal. It is a snippet of reality. And as you go through and you challenge that, you're going to actually have a greater capacity for connection. You're going to have a greater connection for authentic connection, not this proxy connection that we're talking about, where you need shared brokenness or a shared painful experience, a shared trauma, a shared enemy, any of those. You can actually go to the active recognition of I want this person to be part of my becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Because we make friends, and as friends, we make each other. Mm-hmm. We are co-creators of our identity and our existence, and that's the way it's supposed to be. So if you've really leaned into self-growth, great. Now it's time to include more of the with.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to talk about through this series, through this year. We're going to have looks like a group coaching around this too, where we lean into what does it look like to create healthy relationships in this way. So look at your individuation, your protection, your connection, and your seeking of confirmation. All of these things are an awareness that has to develop if we're going to develop healthier connections. Mm-hmm. And we're going to get deeper into this, and it's going to be good.
Yeah.
So thank you for listening. And our hope is that for many of you, this is a more connected year than you may have experienced recently. We want to see healing in the area of connection where people have been hurt, better boundaries for those who need that, more openness and risk for those who have been more isolated, and more intentionality towards already good relationships. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe so you don't miss anything in this series, and you can follow us on Instagram at just Art of Growth. We will be posting some additional videos through this series about this. And make sure you're signed up for our newsletter at theartofgrowth.org so you know when these group coachings are going to be coming out through this series. And take some time this week to assess where some of your relationships are and where you'd like them to be. But for now, my friends, may you know that it is safe to look at the quality of the relationships you have, to look any of the fears of relationship in the face this year, to notice any protective mechanisms that have been functioning. And may you increase the intentionality and awareness of the quality of the relationships that you are investing in or would like to invest in as an aspect of your investment in yourself. And may grace and compassion towards self and others fuel the foundation of the vulnerability, the curiosity, and presence we can bring to each other. Grace and growth, my friends.